Back now with Endgame, there is a presidential race taking place in 29 days. Betsy, quickly on Elizabeth Warren's interview. I thought it was interesting that she decided to go right there with Iran and impeachment, that she saw them connected.
The wag the dog allegations are not a surprise, but it's still significant for her to suggest that the president engaged in this strike for sort of underhanded political motives. One thing that Warren's rivals noticed, and several staffers for rival campaigns flagged this to me, was that she basically put out two different statements on the death of Soleimani. First, she said, Soleimani, terrible person, and then the next day followed up with a tweet calling it an assassination, a term that in this case actually has significant legal weight. Her rival campaigns are pointing to that and saying it's an example of her struggling to try to keep both ends of the Democratic Party happy.
I want to put up an example here. Bernie is going on the attack a little bit. He went on the attack on Biden, and it was over foreign policy. He said that it's just a lot of baggage that Joe takes into a campaign. The baggage he's referring to in this case is the Iraq war vote, Casey Hunt. And he also yesterday went after Pete Buttigieg in a fundraising email. I do want to focus on Sanders v. Biden here because I do think the Iran backdrop presents an interesting contrast. We don't know if voters are going to look at this on the Democratic side of the aisle and say, steady hand Joe Biden, or how about the guy who's always against the interventions here? I don't think we know how Democratic voters are going to react.
And I was talking to some sources about this very question yesterday inside the campaigns, and I think it really depends on who you're trying to talk to. And if you're Joe Biden, you're thinking a lot about swing voters, about voters who like the strong posture. And the arguments they're making are essentially that you go with a guy that's a steady hand. I mean, that is the entire argument behind their whole campaign right now, right? A return to a more normal version of this. I think the question is going to be, how much do the base voters remember and think through Iraq as a motivating factor? I mean, that was what swept Obama into office in 2008. I think the question is, are people kind of past that? Are they seeing that in this kind of a context and are willing to make a bet on Bernie Sanders over it?
Jay, the establishment of the Democratic Party and the foreign policy community is not popular with the base of the Democratic Party either. I mean, Biden's positions and Bernie's positions are different for a reason.
Yes, and foreign policy, as you know, does not typically loom large in an election, in a primary debate, but it did in 07, 08 because of that Iraq war vote. And Obama was on record opposing the Iraq war at the time. Democratic primary voters, as I think Casey has said, basically focus on who's going to be stable, who's going to be thoughtful versus somebody who is completely dovish. Who's going to be careful about getting us into another armed conflict. And it's not, who's the most bullish and who's the biggest saber rattler.
Pat, the hit of the wag the dog hit on the president here, how concerned should he be about that perception? I mean, look, you have the country, we're pretty split. Half the country doesn't believe what comes out of the president's
I'm more
mouth.
concerned about not the politics of it, but our country. Because at this time, I think our country has got to have one voice on foreign policy. I don't mind the criticism. It's the type of criticism and the accusations being occurred so shortly.
But isn't this on the president? I mean, didn't he sort of bring this upon himself because he doesn't choose to speak with one voice? Or, I mean, look
I think.
By the way, there's always a tweet. Let me put up some old tweets here of Donald Trump, citizen Donald Trump. In 2012, this is what he said about Iran and Barack Obama. He said, watch out, I predict President Obama will at some point attack Iran in order to save face. The point being, there's always a tweet. There's always a way where this candidate Trump behaved in a way that he's now upset that people behave against him.
And today we have presidential candidates on the Democratic side signing pledges that they'll never get into a long-term war. I mean, this always happens in every political campaign. Until you get to office, you don't know what you're really going to confront. Interesting, two names in the Democrats that we're not talking about that I saw millions of dollars worth of ads for during the NFL games last night, Steyer and Bloomberg. Steyer, which is spending millions showing us pictures of him growing up. I don't know where he's going. Bloomberg was very interested in seeing his ads, and he didn't bring up outlawing Slurpees, but he's bringing up a whole issue of health care in New York City. I found that very interesting to see if that gets any.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was struck too. You're like, what? Tom Steyer? Yeah. And Bloomberg. I don't know how voters will wonder about this in a month.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I came back to a presidential field after 4 months of being away that looks considerably different than the one that we had in September. I will say that when you look at the actual process, and Chuck, you know this better than anybody, There have been campaigns in the past that have tried to skip the first 4 states, gotten in really late. I mean, Rudy Giuliani knows this better than anybody. That that strategy has
a former New York City mayor.
Past. And people will say, you look at how you accrue delegates to actually win a Democratic nomination. There are not very many Bloomberg-Biden districts out there.
That's the part of this that I've never understood for Bloomberg is how does he win
It's
the
a
delegates
second mayor
that you need? Anyway.
That's running this term.
Thank you, guys. That's all we have for today. What a way to kick off 2020. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week. This is going to be an incredibly important month, let alone year, in American politics. Because if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press. Hello from Washington. I'm Chuck Todd, and thanks for checking out the Meet the Press channel on YouTube. Click on the button down here to subscribe and click over here to watch the latest interviews, highlights, and other digital exclusives.